Hello again. On behalf of the Ancient Tree Forum, welcome to the final webinar in the series covering the VetCert standard at practicing level. This session covers Unit 11, which is veteran tree management in all its aspects. And this is actually the longest unit in both the practicing level and the consulting level, as you might expect. It's divided up into 6 subunits, which is about detailing the basic principles behind veteran tree management, the considerations for management of veteran trees in their environment, implementing specifications for improving habitats, undertaking veteran tree management in accordance with any management plan, identifying the need for and undertake monitoring as required, and that you're able to identify any threats to veteran tree populations. So those are the 6 subsections in this unit, and we'll go through each of them in turn. So you would be expected as a practitioner to detail the overall aim of all veteran tree management and explain why it might be necessary to manage veteran trees. So again, we want to avoid all unnecessary loss of veteran trees. And that's the overall aim, but this is also mentioned again in, Unit 8. So, and that it's about ameliorating any threats, so removing any threats if possible and ameliorating them if they can't be removed. So prevention of soil damage, for example, and it may be that you want to add some mulch. That may be an example. And it's important that you can explain why it's necessary to manage veteran trees. So that's in relation to loss. We want to avoid loss. We want to retain as many as possible. And this you'll be familiar with. We've covered this already in one of the other units that describe the decision-making process before carrying out veteran tree management, that do nothing ought to be your first stop in that process. Then it's looking at the land around the tree. Can you improve the rooting environment? And then finally, the tree itself. So does anything need to be done? Is it just monitor and see what happens? And then next step, obviously, the land around. And we've covered this already, so this is not new to you. So the second one is discussing considerations for management of veteran trees and their environment. So again, this is your applied knowledge that you should be able to identify threats to particular veteran trees or groups of veteran trees. It could be shade, for example. And when thinking about shade, that you take a holistic approach, that may be some benefit in, doing clearing around small glades around several trees that benefit several of them at once. See also units 2 and 4 and 8 in relation to these particular topics. And for pests and diseases, for example, is another, is a threat that you ought to be aware of how your work might impact on veteran trees in relation to this. And we will expect you to be able to identify threats in situ when looking at a veteran tree. Another aspect that we'll expect you to be able to do is to describe a specific veteran tree's reactions to past management and or natural events and how this can affect future management. So I guess this is to go beyond standard arboriculture, where you explain what the tree is telling you, going kind of beyond the standard context. So where are the origin of the branches? Perhaps the whole crown is full of epicormic growth and there are no original branches, and that can vary across the tree. That loss of major limbs in a storm, how it's reacted to previous pruning, for example. So that we would expect you to be able to read the tree, at least to some extent, and then consider that in the context of future management, its current vitality, and how it's responded to those historic events, and which of those events are recent and which are very old. Here's a good example of a tree where basically the whole crown is essentially epicormic growth. It's an old pollard, and you can see there's a branch that's failed there. So we would be expecting you to pick up on those things when you see the trees and when you're visiting a tree, that you should be able to recognise the historic management, recent responses and much older responses. Then as a practicing arborist, you would be expected to show an awareness of why techniques for veteran tree management might differ from standard management guidance. And I mean, what's driving the decisions? That's one of the things that really differs. Do nothing. That's not often the standard practice. The size of the root protection area is another example. Perhaps the size of the wounds that you undertake while pruning may actually be beyond what is standard guidance for a specific purpose. And that's what's important to understand with veterinary management, is the objective of the management, why you're doing what you're doing. And that there's more emphasis perhaps on selecting individual branches rather than making a whole tree symmetrical, whole crown symmetrical, for example. So there's a whole range of factors, and you ought to be able to you should show an awareness of why and how the techniques differ. Once again, understanding and acknowledging the limits of current scientific and professional knowledge. So this isn't just about your knowledge and my knowledge. This is the kind of collective knowledge about management of veteran trees. We know that there's lots of limitations to our ability to understand different things. And in my particular area of work, in particular to ecology, we know there's an awful lot of gaps in our knowledge. And being aware of that is very important, and understanding the limitations of that is very important. And that some of what we do may actually be based on hypotheses rather than actual scientific fact, and it ought to be treated that way. And that, there can be pros and cons to different sorts of management, and understanding those pros and cons helps inform your decision. You should be able to implement specifications for improving habitats in the vicinity of veteran trees where appropriate. And examples of that here, this tree fell over and it's been retained. And this tree has been retained exactly where it fell, in as large a piece of decaying wood as possible. Interesting enough, with this particular photograph, some samples were taken away to date the tree. But it's complementary habitat in relation to veteran tree management. So what do you do with the material if you're pruning the tree? Encouraging perhaps bushes so that you've got good nectar sources. And there may be things like that you can do, and that you can suggest even to site managers if appropriate. You may want to suggest even planting replacement trees as and when trees have fallen over, obviously not too close. So section 4 is the largest section in this unit, because this is about actually undertaking veteran tree management in accordance with the management plan. And it's important to understand the requirements of the management plan and implement them to achieve the desired objectives. So common management operations, crown reduction, soil management, tip pruning, retaining decaying wood in the tree, that you should be aware of those and what the implications of those are and how to put them in place, and communicating that. So both communicating that between your colleagues, between the consultant perhaps who specified, and the site manager. And where new information becomes available, for example, that might affect the management, the practitioner would be expected to be able to communicate that with whoever is relevant in terms of the stakeholders. We would expect you to be able to use your knowledge and experience and existing guidelines to identify the extent of a suitable root protection area for a veteran tree and choose an appropriate method for setting one up. And this is particularly in relation to undertaking the tree work. So access and your work area. Where do you have your materials? Where do you have your fueling station, and so on? And these are always likely to be a compromise, particularly in relation to exploitation. But in terms of when you're working on site, this should be something that's in the forefront of your mind. And we would expect you to be able to identify this in a work site. We would expect you to obviously undertake a pre-climb risk assessment of a veteran tree, and to find out whether the tree is actually safe to climb and if there may be alternative ways of undertaking the work. And this is primarily in relation to the country where you're working. You ought to be aware of the risk assessments and the requirements for you to undertake your work safely. So this is in relation to accessing the tree, and this is very much your applied knowledge. Are there any problems that need to be fed back? Is it possible to climb the tree? Is it safe to climb the tree? Should it be undertaken with a platform instead? And what happens about if access to the tree with a climbing platform? Those sorts of things. Sensitivity too to the fact that there may be features in the tree that you don't want to knock off in the process of climbing the tree too. So they may well form part of your pre-climb risk assessment. And then that you should be able to select the right tools and equipment for the job. And we expect you to be able to do that, in terms of accessing the tree. Is it, as I said, climbing, or is it more appropriate with a platform? What cutting tool do you use? Is it chainsaws, battery saws, hand tools? What sorts of fuels will you use if you use chainsaws? All those kinds of things we would expect you to be able to explain what type of climbing technique you might use as well, and how you would store the fuels, where you would store the fuels, what are the issues in relation to veteran trees that you want to consider. So this is all your applied knowledge. This is your daily working practice, but where you're taking extra account of how you're working with veteran trees. We expect you to be able to prepare pre-work documentation and discuss with the client and or consultant where appropriate. And that may well be a Methodist statement, site access plans. It may not be you that, you may be going to price the work and then you're bringing in your colleagues that have been absolutely clear about site access, what you do with the arisings, any legal consents that may be required, the time of year for cutting, all those sorts of things should be part of your pre-work documentation, and we expect you to be able to do that as a vet cert practicing specialist. You may also have to we expect you to be able to undertake an aerial inspection and record findings to inform tree management. Now, that may well be when you're actually up in the tree to undertake the work that you see something that wasn't obvious from the ground, and that you have that alternative view. And that's very important to be able to give that feedback and to communicate. And we've talked about that in other units, that connecting with the work being undertaken and then what you see when you come up in the tree. And as a vet cert practicing specialist, you would need to be able to undertake an aerial inspection and know what to look for. There can be, I suppose, occasions when cabling and bracing and propping, other sorts of stabilisation techniques may well be appropriate for veteran trees. And they're often much more complicated. As we've said earlier, the biomechanical nature of veteran trees is often much more complicated. So that you ought to be aware of the different mechanisms and methods that are used, and when they are appropriate, the fact that they need to be monitored. They can't just be put up and left. And then what do you do about historic systems that are in place? It's not unusual that you come across veteran trees and ancient trees with big bands round the middle, or with very old cabling systems in place. And how do you deal with that safely, and safely for the operator, but safely for the tree as well? And we would also expect you to be able to describe how you would install a system and what mechanisms you would use, what things you would take account of in terms of how you manage the work to ensure that the best possible work is done without damaging the tree. And that will include, for example, how you might inspect the systems over time and recommendations. We would expect the practitioner to be able to undertake appropriate soil management in accordance with the management plan. Once again, this is applied knowledge about soil management. Where do you source the material? Consider biosecurity, doing things in stages, perhaps not even covering the whole root area. So all those sorts of factors to take into account. And it may be that the management plan specifies that in a very detailed way, but if not, then we would expect the practitioner to have a good understanding of the pros and cons of where you source the material, for example, if it's mulching. And here's an example whereby the mulching's been done in a different way. It's not been covering the whole root system, it's covering sections of the root system at a relatively thin surface layer. We expect, of course, the practitioner to be able to conduct management work whilst minimising any inadvertent damage to the tree, the associated species and its surroundings. And maybe this is stating the obvious, but it's very easy that you knock off a dead branch on the way up or on the way down, being careful when removing material that they don't damage other parts of the tree. All of that is something that we would definitely expect a practicing vet cert specialist to be acutely aware of and be able to describe how you would undertake the work to avoid any of that kind of damage to the tree, either through falling branches that you're cutting off, and that you avoid unnecessary removal, for example, of potential habitats, and that you would have therefore excellent climbing skills to be able to undertake work sensitively without undertaking any kind of damage. We would expect you to be able to show an awareness of why it may be beneficial to phase management works. And this is again another area where it may be different from standard arboricultural practice, that ancient trees need time. They're more sensitive to change. It may be beneficial to do the soil management work now and then come back in 5 years' time and see how the trees have responded before you consider any kind of pruning work, for example. And that's something you ought to be aware of, that issue, giving the tree time to respond in relation to both the tree itself and the associated biodiversity. We would expect a practitioner to be able to implement good practice in terms of biosecurity in accordance with the country. And this is once again applied knowledge. And this is not just in relation to veteran trees, but it also is perhaps more important with regards to veteran trees, because the last thing that any of us would want to do would be to introduce some kind of disease or pest to our most precious trees. So, limiting vehicle access is good practice in relation to biosecurity, and that, using the cut material rather than chipping, for example, may also be good practice. Once again, it's your applied knowledge and relatively standard practice, but we would expect you to be able to show how you would take that into account when undertaking management work. So the subsection 5 in this unit, identify the need for and undertake monitoring. Now, it may not always be the practicing arborist that undertakes monitoring, but sometimes it is, and that you ought to at least be able to show an awareness of the importance of monitoring in veteran tree management. It's often the element that's overlooked, yet it's essential for us to improve our understanding of the impact of the different sorts of management techniques we undertake in relation to veteran trees. It may be, for example, the progress of ash dieback in relation to veteran trees is perhaps something that's really very interesting and very important. The beech trees at Burnham Beeches have had a lot of monitoring, and we've learned a huge amount from that work that's been done. And is the management having the desired effect? It would be terrible to think that we carried on with the same techniques decade in and decade out, and actually some of it may not be the right thing to do. The mortality rates even is something that's very interesting to know and to follow up, particularly after management work has been put in place, because obviously you would want to see a reduction in the mortality rate. We would expect the practitioners to be able to collect information to guide ongoing veteran tree management as instructed. So once again, this is applied knowledge, and it may be that, when have you done the work? What was the time of year? The responses of the work that you've implemented. So if that's soil mulching, for example, or if it's pruning, you may have the opportunity to record that information if you come back to the same trees. So we would expect you to be able to undertake that kind of work. So the final subunit in this unit is about in relation to threats on populations of veteran trees, so that you should be able to detail the issues that impact on the sustainability of veteran tree populations. So once again, this is slightly different from standard arboriculture, perhaps, whereby it's individual trees that we're looking at, but this is much more about being able to identify if the mortality rate is unsustainable, for example, if it's high, which often is the case with veteran trees in shaded environments, it can be high. Also, the numbers of veteran trees, so sites with low numbers of veteran trees, can be a real threat to the species associated with them. There's very often generation gaps in the sites that we're working on, where you have many old trees, but it's a big gap between the next generation. And then, of course, tree diseases like ash dieback, like in this example here in the photograph, that is a major threat both to individual trees, but also to populations. So now we've gone through all of the units of the VetCert practicing standard, and here are some final resources for you for Unit 11 about management. And this is Chapter 4 and 5 in Helen's book about management of veteran trees and management of the land around veteran trees. And then Chapter 4 in David Lonsdale's book about tree work assessment of requirements. Those chapters are specifically relevant for Unit 11. Then there are fact sheets that have been produced as part of the VetCert project on mulching, on cable bracing and propping, and on pests and diseases, which are very useful resources. Then there's videos from the Vet Tree project, which is about crown reduction of veteran trees, halo clearance of veteran trees, and the land around a veteran tree. Those are the three key management areas that are worth looking at if this is an area you feel you'd like to brush up your knowledge on. And then VetCert, there's a number of videos in relation to fungi and trees, which is obviously important, but there's also videos on pole thinning, old pollards, and also a short video on unconventional pruning techniques, which is often something that is a hot topic within veteran tree management. And there's a short video which is outlining some of those unconventional pruning techniques. For example, like leaving stubs is a technique which is quite commonly adopted in pruning veteran trees in comparison to standard practice. So that's now the last and the end of these short webinars taking you through each of the units. And you're welcome to the live Q&A sessions where we can pick up any queries that you might have and hope that you will feel empowered to go ahead and take the VetCert exam and become a VetCert practicing specialist. Thank you.